Hi, my name's Karl Thornton from MDTA, or Modern Defensive Tactics Australia. I'm a combatives instructor. I train self-defence to law enforcement, security operations, as well as to the general public. Back in 2012, I released a video on YouTube called the 20-20-60 survival ratio, which was looking at a study that was undertaken by myself to understand what we call, or to be able to calculate a survival ratio. In other words, looking into when we learn about self-defense, what we learn on a psychological level, what we learn on a physical level, and then whether we're going to apply that under real duress and stress type situations. Anyway, you can always look back on YouTube for that video, the 20-20-60 survival ratio, which is used internationally now in different training environments for security operations training, as well as law enforcement, corporate and general public training. Anyway, more importantly, what this video is about today is to try and give some information on one area that really a lot of people bring up in most training environments. When they're being instructed in self-defense, and when we're talking about the law and what's applicable in relation to self-defense, a lot of people come up with that same question about what is it that I'm allowed to use to defend myself in a situation where I'm under attack or I'm facing an aggressor. Can I hit first? If I do hit first, am I the one that's going to get in trouble? Am I going to put myself in a position where defending myself sees an outcome where I'm imprisoned or charged with assault? Or what are the implications to me looking after or protecting myself? Now, when you first look at the law states that you're allowed to use what force is necessary to stop a real and impending threat, as long as that force is not disproportionate. In other words, as long as you're not using excessive force. Now, obviously, in each country, in each state, laws are going to differ. And although this video is giving you a general information about what I call the 3 L's, you still will need to look into the laws in your country or state or your territory in regards to self-defense. But putting all that aside, no matter what the laws are, no matter what country you're in, I want you to think about the 3 L's as a principle of survival more than looking at it as law applicable information. In other words, I would never teach anybody in any training environment not to work within the law. And even in my one of my publications or books, Violence Evolving, is talking about how we use violence as a survival tool and not like a criminal who's using violence as for criminal intent for an outcome. So it's the same principle here, that when I'm talking about what I call the 3 L's, that we look at those 3 L's more of a survival principle than we do look at it as a law type principle. But at the same time, we do want to work within the law. So what the 3 L's is looking at is trying to answer that question, can I hit first, or what we call preemptively strike when I feel under threat? And if I do, what is going to happen if I do try and defend myself in a situation where my threat is, or my life is under threat? So I like to look at it like this. Let's first break down the law. Although this is a generic look at the law, is whether we look at it as applicable to law or the way we start understanding what we can do to defend ourselves. I'm going to use an outline of that law. Is that you can use what force is necessary to stop a real and impending threat as long as that force is not disproportionate. In other words, as long as it's not excessive force. A question I always ask in seminars is, who can tell you whether you feel under threat? Well, obviously only you can. Nobody can tell you whether you feel threatened. Only you know whether you feel under threat or not. There can be the overt signs of somebody verbally or physically throwing a punch at you, or verbally telling you that they're going to do something to you, which is a verbal threat. They are what we call obvious identifiers. We can tell what's going to happen. But sometimes when that threat is something we feel inside, because the person that may be going to attack is being a little bit more deceptive and a little bit more not really giving those indicators of what's going to happen, but we feel under threat, how do we know, how do we deal with that situation, and when is it applicable or appropriate for me to do something to defend myself? So once again, if we go back to that law where it states under a real and impending threat, what a real and impending threat means is it is imminent. It is going to happen. It's unavoidable. So what we need to do is understand that we can't allow ourselves to be put in a situation where if we don't react or respond, that we allow the attacker to take control, because the consequences may be devastating. In other words, if we look at it as simple as this, if an attacker was to hit me first and I was to go to the ground, in all likelihood, that attacker may turn around and start stomping on me or kicking into me. I don't know what his objective or his outcome is. Whereas if I was to hit somebody first and they fell to the ground when I felt under threat, I'm going to run away. So I've used what force was necessary to stop the threat, and then I've got out of there. I've evacuated or I've retreated. I've got away from the situation. So we look at the difference there, where if they're striking me first, I may not have control over the outcome because I don't know what they're liable or likely to do. Whereas if I take control of my own self-defense by striking, and if I get that opportunity to run, I do it, I've stopped the threat and I've got out of there. So let's break down those 3 L's. The 3 L's are life, law, and live. So what I mean by life, law, and live is simple as this. Let's first have a look at life. In any violent encounter, your life and the life of those that you may need to protect, i.e. family or other people with you, becomes your priority. That becomes mandatory. So I have those life, law, and live set in those sequences of 1, 2, 3 as a priority list. So that priority 1, life, is that in a violent encounter, I've got to make sure that I survive the situation and that those around me that I may need to protect are also protected during that particular situation. So what's going to happen is if I feel under threat, I'm going to have to respond to make sure I take control of the situation as soon as possible. The reason then we have law as a secondary on that priority list is that the law is important and we do need to make sure that we don't use excessive force and we only use what we need to stop that real and impending threat. But at the same time, if I worry about the law before my life, I may not have the chance to go to court and explain my case in the first place. In other words, we've heard the saying, or many people have heard the saying, I'd rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. This is that same sort of principle. Is if I don't defend myself at that possible or that chance or that time when I could find myself being assaulted where I may or may not come out of the situation, I'm not going to have a chance to go to court and argue my case anyway. So what I need to do is understand the law is important, but the law is a secondary result. I need to make sure on my priority list that I'm protecting myself and others first, and then we see how it is applicable to the law. If I worry about the law first and do nothing because I'm worried about whether I'm going to get charged, whether I'm going to jail, what's going to happen, am I going to get sued, all those things I won't really need to worry about if I haven't defended myself and I don't get to court in the first place. I may be injured, I may be severely handicapped after the situation, I may not even survive, I may be in a coma, I may be dead. Whatever it being is, if I worry about the law first, I'm not going to defend myself to give myself a chance or an opportunity to argue my case when it comes to law anyway. So what I mean by law in that list of priorities is that with the law is that in any violent encounter, the law will be my secondary thought and will not override my highest priority to protect my life or those I need to protect. So in other words, law is important and I will always work within law, but at the end of the day, in a violent encounter, an aggressive situation where my life is on the line, I'm going to prioritise my life and those around me first, and then second priority will be the law. So what I mean by live in that life, law, live is then I need to live with the consequences. So what we mean by live is after any violent encounter, I will live with the consequences of my actions that were taken to achieve my highest priority, which was to protect my life or those I needed to protect. So as you can see, again, we have that priority list where I have to live with the consequences, but once again, because that's focusing on my highest priority, which is protecting my life and those around me or that I need to protect. So I'm going to give you a quick example here because I don't want this video to go on for too long. I'm going to give you a quick example here. Let's say somebody broke into my home. There was a home invasion and I suddenly confronted the intruder and a scuffle was about to unfold, or I was about to be attacked by that intruder. I'm not going to worry about the law first. I'm going to protect myself and I'm going to protect my family by making sure I do something there and then to stop that real and impending threat, that imminent threat. So let's say I've struck the attacker. Let's say the attacker's fallen over, hit his head on the coffee table and ended up deceased. Now, when I go to court, there is a possibility under the law that I may get charged with grievous bodily harm, I may get charged with manslaughter, I may get charged with murder. There's all these things that I may get charged with. I may also get let off with self-defense because of defending myself and my family within the home. I may get off with self-defense. Whichever way, I'm going to have to get to court in the first place to be able to argue my case to try and see what is going to happen or what the outcome's going to be. But what happens in any of those circumstances, I'm going to have to live with the consequences. In other words, let's say I get let off with self-defense, which I should, then that's great. I've now been let off with self-defense, end of story. If I don't, and all of a sudden I find myself doing 5, 10, 15 years, you know what? I'd rather live with those consequences than not have reacted and protected myself, where I may have not got through it, I may have been killed myself, or my family been injured or killed, and then living with those consequences because I didn't do anything. So I want you to think of those 3 L's as a priority list, where it's life, law, and live. Life is my highest priority. Law is a secondary priority where I'm going to try and work within the law, but life is my priority of myself and those that I'm trying to protect, and then I will live with the consequences. I explain this in more detail in my book called In Your Hands, which is looking at avoiding grappling and preemptive striking, but there is a chapter in there that covers this, what we call, or what I call, the 3 L's.